The Arnold render settings give us a great deal of control over how the render is processed. This allows us to optimize render times by allocating more computing time to different aspects of the shot. Let's go ahead and open up the render settings window, and additionally open up the Arnold render view so we can see our changes in real time. Arnold render view. I want to render the camera view, so I'll choose that from the pull-down list, camera shape 1. And back in our render settings, go to the Arnold Renderer tab. And the two most important sections here are sampling and ray depth. So let's open that one up too. Sampling controls the fidelity, and in this case it will help us eliminate this grain that we're seeing here. The first attribute here is anti-aliasing, and it's labeled camera AA. And it's currently set to 3, and that is actually a pretty good value for production. If you're doing a draft render, you might want to bring this down to a very low or even a negative number, and then your rendering will be kind of a mosaic, meaning that it's not actually sampling every pixel. It's only sampling every 4th pixel here. So I might bring that up to 0 for a draft render, or up to 3 for a full production render. We still have a lot of grain here, and that's because we don't have very many samples for the diffuse component. And the label diffuse here refers to indirect illumination on diffuse surfaces. In other words, bounce light or color bleed. Increasing the diffuse samples will help us eliminate that grain. I'll drag that slider all the way over to its default maximum of 10. And so it's going to take a lot longer. Instead of a few seconds, it might take up to a minute. Once the render has completed, it's clear that the grain has been reduced but not completely eliminated. If we look in the shadow areas, it's still a bit grainy. We can zoom in on that with the mouse wheel and use the Alt and middle mouse button to pan around. And there's the grain. We can restore this view back to 1 to 1 using the O key on the keyboard. If I wanted to completely eliminate that grain, I could bring this diffuse value up even higher. It doesn't max out where the slider ends. We could type in any value we wanted. I might do 16 diffuse, and that would take a lot longer to render once again, but we would probably get rid of all the grain. For the purposes of the demo, I'm going to bring the diffuse amount back down to 3. The other attributes listed below diffuse are the number of samples for the other scene components, such as glossy reflections and subsurface scattering. My shot doesn't use any of that. This is an ideal diffuse material, and so increasing these would not have any effect currently. In the ray depth section, we control how many bounces occur. The default value of 1 for the number of diffuse bounces means that light will hit a surface, such as the tablecloth, and then bounce off of that surface to illuminate nearby surfaces, such as the wall. Once it hits that second surface, the ray stops and there's no further bounces. As we increase the number of diffuse rays, we increase the number of bounces, and our shot will get brighter. I'll bring the diffuse rays value up to 10, and immediately you can see that our shot is much brighter. It's still just as grainy because the diffuse samples are still set to 3 up here. You'll need to tune these settings to each individual shot in order to get the look that you want and optimize the render time. As you increase these values, the maximum number of samples goes up. So with diffuse rays of 10, I could potentially have 162 samples for that diffuse component. If I bring the diffuse ray depth down to a more conservative value, such as 5, then the maximum number of diffuse samples goes down accordingly. I've now got a maximum of 117. For a production rendering, I would probably bring the number of diffuse samples up to a higher value of at least 10 or so. So you need to experiment with these and see how they kind of work together so you find the right sweet spot for each shot. And that's how you use the Arnold Renderer settings. Let's go into the System tab, and I have a few things I want to point out. Most importantly, everything that we do in the Render Settings dialog here will be saved in the scene and not in our user preferences. When you create a new scene, you'll get default settings here in the render settings. So for every new scene, you're going to want to check in on these. Scrolling down, the important ones, here we have search paths. I recommend disabling absolute texture paths so that your paths to bitmaps and so on will be relative to your current project. Notice that simply turning on or off irrelevant switches here actually triggers a redraw in the Arnold render view. And if you don't want that to happen, you can turn off scene updates here. Back to our render settings, we also have auto detect threads. Here's where we can globally throttle Arnold to use only a certain number of cores or threads on the computer. And if I turn it off, then we can set the number of threads that Arnold will use. I've got 8 virtual cores on my computer, so I might choose 7 here. I could set this to a value of 7. And that would leave 1 core open for other things. Even more interestingly, we can set this to a negative number, in which case Arnold will use the number of cores that we have on our computer minus this number. I've got 8 virtual cores, and if I want to leave 2 of those threads open for other processes, I can set the number of threads here to -2. And that will also affect the behavior of the Arnold render view. It will only be able to use my current number of cores -2. One last tweaky little setting. Go back into the Arnold Renderer tab and scroll down near the bottom to Lights. And there is a low light threshold here. If you have extreme low light conditions in your shot, then the lighting may get cropped off. This is an optimization so that really dark shadows in the scene don't get calculated. But if you do have a low light scene, such as one that maybe uses interior photometrics, then the cropping is going to be a problem and parts of your scene won't render. I recommend setting the low light threshold to a value of 0. And these settings are all saved once again in my scene file and not in the Maya preferences. Those are the important render settings for Arnold, and that concludes our chapter on Arnold concepts.